Hello. Welcome in. Today, we are going to start The Bodysnatcher by Robert Louis Stevenson. I spelled his name wrong in the title, my bad. Oopsie. But we're starting. I do have the link pinned in chat for anyone that would like to follow along. But otherwise, we will start. Every night in the year, four of us sat in the small parlor of the George at Denenbaum. The undertaker, the landlord, and Fetz, and myself. Sometimes there would be more, but blow high, blow low, come rain or snow or frost, we four would be each planted in his own particular armchair. Fetz was a drunken old Scotchman, a man of education obviously, and a man of some property, since he lived in idleness. He had come to Denenbaum years ago, while still young, and by a mere continuance of living had grown to be an adopted townsman. His blue camlet cloak was a local antiquity, like the church spire. His place in the parlor at the George, his absence from the church, his old, crapulous, disreputable vices, were all things, of course, in Denenbaum. Womp womp, hi hi, welcome in. You're just in time, we just started. I have the link if you'd like to follow along. He had some vague radical opinions of some fleeting infidelities, which he would now and again set forth and emphasize with tottering slaps on the table. He drank rum 5 glasses regularly every evening, and for the greater portion of his nightly visit to the George with his glass in his right hand, in a state of melancholy alcoholic saturation. He called him the doctor, for he was supposed to have some kind of special knowledge of medicine, and had been known, upon a pinch, to set a fracture or reduce a dislocation. But beyond these slight particulars, we had no knowledge of his character, and antecedents. Too tired to read and put gladly listen. That is okay. One dark winter night, it had struck 9 some time before the landlord joined us. There was a sick man in the George. A great neighboring proprietor suddenly struck down with the apoplexy on his way to the Parliament, and the great man, still greater London doctor, had been telegraphed to his bedside. It was the first time that such a thing had happened in Denenbaum, for the railway was newly open, and we were all proportionately moved by the occurrence. "He's come," said the landlord, after he had filled and lighted his pipe. "He?" said I. "Who? Not the doctor." "Himself," replied the host. "What is his name?" "Dr. McFarlane," said the landlord. Fetz was far through his 3rd tumbler, stupidly fuddled, and now nodding over and over, now staring mazily around him. But at the last word he seemed to awaken, and repeated the name McFarlane twice, quietly enough for the first time, but with a sudden emotion at the second. "Yes," said the landlord, "that's his name, Dr. Wolfe McFarlane." Fetz became instantly sober. His eyes awoke, his voice became clear, loud, and steady, his language forcible and earnest. We were all startled by the transformation, as if a man had risen from the dead. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I am afraid I have not been paying much attention to your talk. Who is this Wolfe McFarlane?" And then, when he had heard the landlord out, it cannot be. It cannot be, he added, and yet I would like to well see him face to face. Do you know him, doctor? Asked the undertaker with a gasp. Oh, God forbid, was the reply, and yet the name is a strange one. It were too much too fancy to. Tell me, landlord, is he old? Well, said the host, he's not a young man, to be sure, and his hair is white, but he looks younger than you. He is older, though, years older, but with a slap on the table, it's the rum you see in my face, rum and sin. This man, perhaps, may have an easy conscience and a good good digestion. Conscience. Hear me out. Would you think I was some good old decent Christian, would you not? But no, not I. I never canted. Voltaire might have canted if he stood in my shoes, but the brains, with the rattling fillip on his bald head, the brains were clear and active, and I saw and made no deductions. Hello, hello. Yeah, we're starting off goofy. If you know this doctor, I ventured to remark after a somewhat awful pause, I should gather that you do not share the landlord's good opinion. Fetz paid no regard to me. Yes, he said with a sudden decision, I must see him face to face. There was another pause, and then the door was closed rather sharply on the first floor, and a step was heard upon the stair. That's the doctor, cried the landlord. Look sharp, and you can catch him. It was but 2 steps from the small parlor to the door of the Old George Inn. The wide oak staircase landed almost in the street. There was room for a turkey rug and nothing more between the threshold and the last round of the descent. But this little space was every evening brilliantly lit up, not only by the light upon the stair and the great signal lamp below the sign, but by the warm radiance of the bar-room window. The George thus brightly advertised itself to passer-by in the cold street. Fetz walked steadily down to the spot, and we, who were hanging behind, beheld the 2 men meet, as one of them had phrased it, face to face. Dr. McFarlane was alert and vigorous, his white hair set off the pale and placid, although energetic, countenance. He was richly dressed in the finest of broadcloth and the whitest of linen, and a great gold watch chain, and studs and speckles of the same precious metal. He wore a broad folded tie, white and speckled with lilac, and he carried on his arm a comfortable driving coat of fur. There was no doubt but he became his years, breathing, as he did, of wealth and consideration. And it was a surprising contrast to see our parlor sot, bald, dirty, pimpled, and robed in this old camlett cloak, confronted him at the bottom of the stairs. A rockwood goofy and alcoholic. McFarlane, he said somewhat loudly. More like a herald than a friend. The great doctor pulled up short of the 4th step, as though the familiarity of the address surprised and somewhat shocked his dignity. Toddy McFarlane, repeats Fetz. The London man almost staggered. He stared for the swiftest of seconds at the man before him, glanced behind him, and with a sort of scare, and then in a startled whisper, Fetz? He said. You? Aye, said the other. Me? Did you think I was dead too? We are not so easy shut of our acquaintance. Hush, 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 exclaimed the doctor. Hush, hush! This meeting is so unexpected. I can see you're unmanned. I hardly knew you, I confess, at first, but I'm overjoyed to have this opportunity. For it must present, for the present, it must be how do you do and goodbye in one. For my fly is waiting, and I must not fail the train. But you shall, let me see. Yes, you shall give me your address, and you can count on early news of me. We must do something for you, Fetz. I fear you are out at elbows, but we must see to that, see to that for an auld lang syne, as once we sang at suppers. Money, cried Fetz, money from you! The money that I had from you is lying where I cast it in the rain. Dr. McFarlane had talked himself into some measure of superiority and confidence, but the uncommon energy of this refusal cast him back to his first confusion. A horrible, ugly look came and went across his almost vulnerable countenance. My dear fellow, he said, be it as you please. My last thought is to offend you. I would intrude on none. I will leave you my address. However, I do not wish it. I do not wish to know the roof that shelters you, interrupted the other. I've heard your name. I feared it might be you. I wish to know if, after all, there were a god. I know now that there is none. Be gone! He stood still at the middle of the rug, between the stair and the doorway, and the great London physician, in order to escape, would be forced to step to one side. It was plain that he hesitated before the thought of his humiliation. White as he was, there was a dangerous glitter in his spectacles. But while he still paused uncertain, he became aware that the driver of his fly was peering in from the street at this unusual scene and caught a glimpse at the same time of our little body from the parlor, huddled by the corner of the bar. Begone! The presence of so many witnesses decided him at once to flee. He crouched together, brushing on the wainscot, and made a dart like a serpent, striking for the door. But his tribulation was not yet entirely at an end, for even as he was passing, Fetz clutched him by the arm, and these words came in a whisper, and yet painfully distinct. Have you seen it again? The great rich London doctor cried out aloud with a sharp, throttling cry. He dashed his questionnaire across the open space, and, with his hand over his head, fled out of the door like a detected thief. Before it had occurred to one of us to make a movement, the fly was already rattling towards the station. The scene was over like a dream, but the dream had left proofs and traces of his passage. The next day, the servant found the fine gold spectacles broken on the threshold, and that very night we were all standing breathless by the barroom window, and Fetz at our side, sober, pale, and resolute in look. God protect us, Mr. Fetz, said the landlord, coming first into possession of his customary senses. What in the universe is all this? These are strange things you've been saying. Fetz turned towards us. He looked us each in succession in the face. See if you can hold your tongues, said he. That man McFarlane is not safe to cross. Those that have done so already have repented it too late. And then, without so much as finishing his third glass, far less waiting for the other two, he bade us goodbye and went forth, under the lamp of the hotel, into the black night. Wow, spooky. We three turned to our places in the parlor, with the big red fire and 4 clear candles, and as we recapitulated, that's a word, what had passed, the first chill of our surprise soon changed into a glow of curiosity. We sat late. It was the latest session I've ever known in the old George. Each man, before we parted, had his theory that he was bound to prove. None of us had any nearer business in the world than to track out the past of our condemned companion, and surprise the secret that he shared with the great London doctor. It is no great boast, but I believe I was a better hand at worming out a story than either of my fellows at the George, and perhaps there is now no other man alive who can narrate to you the following foul and unnatural events. In his young days, Fetz studied medicine in the school of Edinburgh. He had talent of a kind, and the talent that picks up swiftly what it hears and readily retells it for its own. He worked a little at home, but he was civil, attentive, and intelligent in the presence of his masters. They soon picked him out as a lad who listened closely and remembered well. Nay, strange as it seemed to me when I first heard it, he was in those days well favored and pleased by his exterior. There was, at that period, a certain extramural teacher of anatomy, whom I shall here designate by the letter K. His name was subsequently too well known. The man who bore it all skulked through the streets of Edinburgh in disguise, while the mob that applauded at the execution of Burke called loudly for the blood of his employer. But Mr. K was at the top of his vogue. He enjoyed a popularity due partly to his own talent in address, partly to the incapacity of his rival, the university professor. The students at least swore by his name, and Fetz believed himself, and was believed by others to have laid the foundations of his success when he had acquired the favor of his meteorically famous man? What? The fuck does that mean? Sure. Mr. K was bon vivant, as well as an accomplished teacher. He liked a sly illusion no less than a careful preparation. In both capacities, Fetz enjoyed and deserved his notice, and by the second year of his attendance, he held the half-regular position of second demonstrator or sub-assistant in his class. In this capacity, the charge of the theater and lecture room devolved in particular upon his shoulders. He had to answer for the cleanliness of the premises and the conduct of the other students, and it was part of his duty to supply, receive, and divide the various subjects. It was with a view at last, at that time very delicate, affair that he was lodged by Mr. K, in the same wind, and at last in the same building with the dissecting rooms. Here, after a night of turbulent pleasures, his hands still tottering, his sight still misty and confused, he would be called out of bed to the black hours before the winter dawn by the unclean and desperate interlopers who supplied the table. He would open the doors to these men, since infamous throughout the land. He would help them with their tragic burden, pay them their sordid price, and remain alone, and when they were gone, with the unfriendly relics of humanity. From such a scene he would return to snatch another hour or two of slumber, to repair the abuses of the night, and refresh himself for the labors of the day. Few lads could have been more insensible to the impressions of a life thus passed along the signs of morality. His mind was closed against all general considerations. He was incapable of interest in the fate and the fortunes of another, the slave of his own desires and low ambitions. Cold, light, and selfish in the last resort, he had the modicum of prudence, miscalled morality, which keeps a man from inconvenient drunkenness or punishable theft. He coveted, besides, a measure of consideration from his masters and his fellow pupils. He had no desire to fail conspicuously in the external parts of life. Thus he made it his pleasure to gain some distinction in his studies, and day after day rendered unimpeachable eye service to his employer, Mr. K. For his day of work, thank you for the follow. Hope you enjoy the story. For his day of work, he indemnified himself by nights of roaring, blackguardly enjoyment, and when that balance had been struck, the organ that he called his conscience declared itself content. The supply of subjects was a continual trouble to him, as well as to his master. In that large and busy class, the raw material of the anatomists kept perpetually running out, and the business thus rendered necessary was not only unpleasant in itself, but threatened dangerous consequences to all who were considered. It was the policy of Mr. K to ask no questions in the dealings with the trade. They bring the body, and we pay the price, he used to say, dwelling on the alliteration quid pro quo. And again, somewhat profanely, ask no questions. He would tell his assistants for conscience sake. There was no understanding that the subjects were provided by the crime of murder. Had that idea been broached to him in words, he would have recoiled in horror. But the lightness of his speech upon so grave a matter was, in itself, an offense against good manners, and a temptation to the men with whom he dealt. Betts, for instance, had often remarked to him upon the singular freshness of the bodies. He had been struck again and again by the hangdog, abominable looks by the ruffians who came to him before the dawn, and putting things together clearly in his private thoughts, he perhaps attributed a meaning too immoral and too categorical the unguarded counsels of his master. He understood his duty, in short, and to have three branches: to take what was brought, to pay the price, and to avert the eye of any evidence of crime. One November morning, this policy of silence was put sharply to the test. He had been awake all night with a racking toothache, pacing his room like a caged beast or throwing himself in fury on his bed, and had fallen at the last into the profound uneasy slumber that so often falls on a night of pain. When he was awakened by the third or fourth angry repetition of concerted signal. There was a thin, bright moonshine. It was a bitter cold, windy, and frosty. The town had not yet awakened, but an indefinable stir already preluded the noise and business of the day. The ghouls had come later than usual, and they seemed more than usually eager to be gone. Fat, sick with sleep, lighted them upstairs. He heard their grumbling Irish voices through a dream, and as they stripped the sack from their sad merchandise, he leaned dozing, with his shoulder propped against the wall. He had to shake himself to find the men with their money. As he did so, his eyes lighted on the dead face. He started. He took 2 steps nearer, with the candle raised. "God almighty!" he cried. "That's Jane Galbraith!" The men answered nothing. They shuffled nearer to the door. "I know her, I tell you," he continued. "She was alive and hearty yesterday. It's impossible she can be dead. It's impossible you should have gotten this body fairly." "Sure, sir. You're mistaken entirely," said one of the men. But the other looked Fetz darkly in the eyes and demanded the money on the spot. It was impossible to misconceive the threat or to exaggerate the danger. The lad's heart failed him. He stammered some excuses, counted out the sum, and saw the hateful visitors depart. No sooner were they gone than he hastened to confirm his doubts. By a dozen unquestionable marks, he identified the girl he had jested with just the day before. He saw with horror marks upon her body that might well betoken violence. A panic seized him, and he took refuge in his room. There he reflected at length over the discovery that he had made, considered soberly the bearing of Mr. K's instructions and the danger to himself of interference in so serious a business, and at last, in sore perplexity, determined to wait for the advice of his immediate superior, the class assistant. This was a young doctor, Wolfe McFarlane, a high favorite among all the reckless students, clever, dissipated, and unscrupulous to the last degree. He had traveled and studied abroad. His manners were agreeable and a little forward. He was an authority on the stage, skillful on the ice or on the links with the skate or golf club. He dressed with a nice audacity, and, to put the finishing touch upon his glory, he kept a gig and a strong trotting horse. With Fetz he was on terms of intimacy. Indeed, their relative positions called for some community of life, and when subjects were scarce, the pair would drive far into the country in McFarlane's gig, visit and desecrate some lonely graveyard, and return before dawn with their booty to the door of the dissecting room. No, that said booty. Okay. On that particular morning, McFarlane arrived somewhat earlier than his wont. Fetz heard him and met him on the stairs, told him his story, and showed him the cause of his alarm. McFarlane examined the marks on her body. "Yes," he said with a nod. "It looks fishy." "Well, what should I do?" asked Fetz. "Do?" repeated the other. "Do you want to do anything?" At least said soonest mended, I should say." "Someone else might recognize her," objected Fetz. "She was as well known as the Castle Rock." "We'll hope not," said McFarlane. "And if anybody does, well, you didn't, don't you see, and there's an end. The fact is, this has been going on too long. Stir up the mud and you'll get Kay into the most unholy trouble. You'll be in a shocking box yourself." "So will I, if you come to that. I should like to know how any one of us would look, or what the devil we should have to say for ourselves, in any Christian witness box. For me, you know, there's one thing certain, that, practically speaking, all our subjects have been murdered." "McFarlane!" cried Fetz. "Come now," sneered the other, "as if you haven't suspected it yourself." "Suspecting is one thing, and proof is another. Yes, I know. And I'm sorry as you are, and I'm as sorry as you are, and this should have not come here," tapping the body with his cane. "The next best thing for me is to not recognize it, and," he added coolly, "I don't. You may, if you please. I don't dictate, but I think a man of the world would do as I do. And I may add, I fancy that this is what Kay would look for at our hands. The question is, why did he choose us two for his assistants?" And I answered because he didn't want old wives. This was the tone of all the others to the effect of the mind of a lad like Fetz. He agreed to imitate McFarlane. The body of the unfortunate girl was duly dissected, and no one remarked or appeared to recognize her. One afternoon, when his day's work was over, Fetch dropped into a popular tavern and found McFarlane sitting with a stranger. This was a small man, very pale and dark, with coal-black eyes. The cut of his features gave a promise of intellect and refinement, which was but feebly realized in his manners, for he proved, upon near acquaintance, coarse, vulgar, and stupid. He exercised, however, a very remarkable control over McFarlane, issued orders like the great Pasha, became inflamed at least. I can't read. Became inflamed at the least discussion or delay, and commented rudely on his civility with which he was obeyed. The most offensive person took a fancy to Fetz on the spot, plied him with drinks, and honored him with the unusual confidences on his past career. If a tenth part of what he confessed were true, he was a very loathsome rogue, and the lad's vanity was tickled by the attention of so inexperienced man. I'm a pretty bad fellow myself, the stranger remarked, but McFarlane is the boy. Toddy McFarlane, I call him. Toddy, order your friend another glass. Or it might be, Toddy, you jump up and shut the door. Toddy hates me, he said again. Oh yes, Toddy, you do. Don't you call me that confounded name, growled McFarlane. Hiram, did you ever see the lad's play knife? You'd like to do that all over my body, remarked the stranger. We medicals have a better way than that, said Fetz. When we dislike a dead friend of ours, we dissect him. McFarlane looked up sharply, as though his jest were scarcely to his mind. The afternoon passed. Gray, for that was the stranger's name, invites Fetz over to join him for dinner, ordered a feast so scrumptious that the tavern was thrown into commotion, and when all was done, commanded McFarlane to settle the bill. That's fucking rude. It was late before they separated. The man Gray was incapably drunk. McFarlane, sobered by his fury, chewed the cud of the money he had been forced to squander and the slights he had been obliged to swallow. Fetz, with various liquors singing in his head, returned home with devious footsteps and a mind entirely in abeyance. The next day McFarlane was absent from class, and Fetz smiled to himself as he imagined him still squaring in the intolerable Gray from tavern to tavern. As soon as the hour of liberty had struck, he posted from place to place in quest of his last night's companions. He could find them, however, nowhere. So returned early to his rooms, went to bed early, and slept the sleep of the just. At 4 in the morning, he was awakened by the well-known signal. Descending to the door, he was filled with astonishment to find McFarlane with his gig, and in the gig of one of those long and ghastly packages which he was so well acquainted. What? He cried. Have you been out alone? How did you manage? McFarlane silenced him roughly, bidding him to turn to business. When they had got the body upstairs and laid it on the table, McFarlane made at first as if he were going to go away. Then he paused and seemed to hesitate, and then, "You better look at the face," he said in tones of some constraint. "You had better," he repeated. Svets only stared at him in wonder. "But where, and how, and when did you come by it?" cried the other. "Look at the face," was the only answer. Fetz was staggered. Strange doubts assailed him. He looked from the young doctor to the body, and then back again. At last, with a start, he did as he was bidden. He had almost expected the sight that had met his eyes, and yet the shock was cruel. To see, fixed in the rigidity of death, and naked on the coarse layer of the sackcloth, the man whom he had left well-clad, full of meat and sin upon the threshold of the tavern, awoke, even in the thoughtless Fetz, some of the terrors of the conscience. It was a cross tibby, which re-echoed his soul, that two whom he had known should come to lie upon his icy tables. Yet these were the only secondary thoughts. His first concern regarded Wolf, unprepared to challenge so monumentous. He knew not how to look at his comrade in the face. He durst not meet his eye, and he had neither words nor voice at his command. It was McFarlane himself who made the first advance. He came up quietly behind and laid his hand gently but firmly on the other's shoulder. "Richardson," said he, "may have the head." Now Richardson was a student who had been long anxious for that portion of the human subject to dissect. There was no answer, and the murderer resumed. "Talking of business, you must pay me. Your accounts, you see, must tally." Betts found a voice, the ghost of his own. "Pay you?" he cried. "Pay you for that?" "Why, yes, of course you must. By all means, on every possible account, you must," returned the other. "You dare not give it to you for nothing. You dare not take it for nothing. It would compromise us both. This is another case like Jane Galbraith's. The more things are wrong, the more we must act as if it were right. Where does old K keep his money?" "There," answered Fetz hoarsely, pointing to the cupboard in the corner. "Give me the key, then," said the other, calmly, holding out his hand. There was an instant hesitation, and the die was cast. McFarlane could not suppress a nervous twitch, the infinitesimal mark of an immense relief, as he felt the key between his fingers. He opened the cupboard, brought out pen and ink and a paper book that stood in one compartment, and separated from the funds in the drawer a sum suitable for the occasion. "Now, look here," he said. "There is the payment made. First proof of your good faith. First step to your security. You now have to cinch it. You now have to clinch it by a second. Enter that payment in your book, and then, for your part, may defy the devil." The next few seconds were for Fetz an agony of thought, but in balancing his terrors, it was the most immediate that triumphed. Any future difficulty seemed almost welcome if he could avoid a present quarrel with McFarlane. He had set down the candle which he had been carrying all this time, and with a steady hand entered the date, the nature, and the amount of the transaction. "And now," said McFarlane, "it is only fair that you should pocket the lucre. I've had my share already. By the by, when a man of the word falls into a bit of luck, has a few shillings extra in his pocket, I'm ashamed to speak of it, but there's a rule of conduct in this case. No treating, no purchase of expensive class books, no squaring of old debts. Borrow, don't lend." "McFarlane," began Fetz, still somewhat hoarsely, "I have put my neck in a halter to oblige you." "To oblige me?" cried Wolf. "Oh, come. Did you, as near as I can see the matter, what you downright had to do in self-defense? Suppose I got into trouble, where would you be? The second little matter flows clearly from the first. Mr. Gray is a continuation of Miss Galbraith. You can't begin and then stop. If you begin, you must keep going. Well, you must keep on beginning. That's the truth. No rest for the wicked." A horrible sense of blackness and the treachery of fate seized hold upon the soul of the unhappy student. "My God!" he cried. "But what have I done? And when did I begin? To be made a class assistant in the name of reason? Where's the harm in that? Service wanted the position. Service might have gotten it. Would he have been where I am now?" "My dear fellow," said McFarlane, "what a boy you are. What harm has come to you? What harm can come to you if you hold your tongue? Why, man, do you know what life this is? There are two squads of us, the lions and the lambs. If you're a lamb, you'll come to lie upon these tables like Gray or Jane Galbraith. If you're a lion, you'll live and drive a horse like me, like Kay, like all the world with any wit or courage. You're staggered at the first, but look at Kay. My dear fellow, you're clever. You have pluck. I like you, and Kay likes you. You were born to lead the hunt, and I tell you, on my honor and on my experience of life, 3 days from now you'll laugh at these scarecrows like high school boys at a farce." And with that, McFarlane took his departure and drove off in the wind to his gig to get under the cover before daylight. Fetz was thus left alone with his regrets. He saw the miserable peril in which he stood involved. He saw with inexpressible dismay that there was no limit to his weakness, and that from concession to concession, he had fallen from the arbiter of McFarlane's density to his paid and helpless accomplice. He would have given the word to have been a little braver at the time, but it did not occur to him that he might still be brave. The secret of Jane Galbraith and the cursed entry in the daybook closed his mouth. Hours passed. The class began to arrive. The members of the unhappy Grey were dealt out to one and to another, and received without remark. Richardson was made happy with the head, and before the hour of the freedom rang, Fetz trembled with exultation to perceive how far they had already gone towards safety. For 2 days he continued to watch, with increasing joy, the dreadful process of disguise. On the 3rd day, McFarlane made his appearance. He had been ill, he said, but he made up for the lost time by the energy with which he directed the students. To Richardson, in particular, he extended the most valuable assistance and advice, and that student, encouraged by the praise of the demonstrator, burned high with ambitious hopes, and saw the medal already in his grasp. I can't read, sorry. Before the week was out, McFarlane's prophecy had been fulfilled. Fetz had outlived his terrors and had forgotten his baseness. He began to plume himself upon his courage, and had so arranged the story in his mind that he could look back on these events with an unhealthy pride. Of his accomplishments, he saw but little. They met, of course, in the business of the class. They received their orders together from Mr. K. At times they had a word or two in private, and McFarlane was from first till last particularly kind and jovial. It was plain that he avoided any reference to their common secret, and even when Fetz whispered to him that he had cast in his lot with the lions and the forsworn the lambs, he only signed to him smilingly to hold his peace. At length an occasion arose which threw the pair once more into a closer union. Mr. K was again short of subjects, pupils were eager, and it was a part of his teacher's pretensions, to be always well supplied. At the same time, there came the news of a burial in the rustic graveyard of Glencorse. Time has little changed in the place in question. It stood then, as now, upon crossroad, out of call of human habitations, and buried fathom deep in the foliage of 6 cedar trees. The cries of the sheep upon the neighboring hills, the streamlets upon either hand, one loudly singing among the pebbles, and the other dripping furtively from pond to pond. The stir of the wind in the mountainous old flowering chestnuts, and once in 7 days the voice of the bell and the old tunes of the precentor were the only sounds that disturbed the silence around the rural church. The Resurrection Man, to use the by-name of the period, was not to be deterred by any of the sanctities of customary piety. It was part of his trade to despise and desecrate the scrolls of trumpets of old tombs, the paths worn by the feet of worshippers and the mourners, and the offerings of the inscriptions of bereaved affection. To rustic neighborhoods, where love is more than commonly tenacious, and where some bonds of blood or fellowship unite the entire society of parish, the Bodysnatcher, far from being repelled by the natural respect, was attracted by the ease and safety of the task. The bodies that had been laid in earth in joyful expectation of a far different awakening, there came a hasty, lamp-lit, terror-haunted resurrection of the spade and the mattock. The coffin was forced, the cerements torn, and the melancholy relics, clad in sackcloth after being rattled for hours on moonless byways, were at length exposed to uttermost indignities before a class of gaping boys. Somewhat as 2 vultures may swoop upon a dying lamb, Fetz and McFarlane were to be let loose upon a grave in that green and quiet resting place. The wife of a farmer, a woman who had lived for 60 years, and been known for nothing but good butter and a godly conversation, was to be rooted from her grave at midnight and carried, dead and naked, to that faraway city that she had always honored with her Sunday's best. The place beside her family was to be empty till the crack of doom. Her innocence and almost venerable memories to be exposed to that last curiosity of the anatomist. Late one afternoon, the pair set forth, well wrapped in cloaks and furnished with a formidable bottle. It rained without remission, a cold, dense, lashing rain. Now and again there blew a puff of wind, but these sheets of falling water kept it down. Bottle and all, it was a sad and silent drive as far as Peniswick, where they were to spend the evening. They stopped once to hide their implements in a thick bush not far from the churchyard, and once again at the Fisher's Tryst, to have a toast before the kitchen fire and vary their nips of whiskey with a glass of ale. When they reached their journey's end, the gig was housed, the horse was fed and comforted, and the two young doctors in a private room sat down to the best dinner and the best wine the house afforded. The lights, the fire, the beating rain upon the window, the cold, incongruous work that lay before them added zest to their enjoyment of the meal. With every glass, their cordiality increased. Soon MacFarlane handed a little pile of gold to his companion. "A compliment," he said, "between friends, these little..." What is censored here? These little deed accommodations ought to fly like pipe lights. It's D hyphen D. I'm not sure what's being censored here. Fetz pocketed the money and applauded the sentiment of the echo. "You're a philosopher," he cried. "I was an ass till I knew you. You and Kay, between you, by the Lord Harry, but you'll make a man of me." "Of course we shall," applauded MacFarlane. "A man? I tell you, it required a man to back me up the other morning. There are some big, brawly 40-year-olds crawling, 40-year-old cowards, who would have turned sick at the look of the dead thing." I'm assuming that's what that is. "But not you. You kept your head. I watched you." "Well, and why not?" Fetz thus vaunted himself. "It was no affair of mine. There was nothing to gain on the one side but disturbance, and on the other I could count on your gratitude, don't you see?" He slapped his pocket till the gold pieces rang. MacFarlane somehow felt a certain touch of alarm at these unpleasant words. He may have regretted that he had taught his young companion so successfully, but he had no time to interfere, for the other noisily continued with his boastful strain. "The great thing is to not be afraid. Now, between you and me, I don't want to hang. That's practical. But for all cant, MacFarlane, I was born with a content. Hell, God, devil, right, wrong, sin, crime, and all that old gallery of curiosities, they may frighten boys, but men of the world, like you and me, despise them. Here's to the memory of Gray." It was by this time growing somewhat late. The gig, according to the order, was brought round to the door with both lamps brightly shining, and the young men had to pay their bill and take the road. They announced that they were bound for Peebles, and drove in the direction till they were clear of the last houses of the town. Then, extinguishing the lamps, returned upon their course, and followed a by-road towards Glencorse. There was no sound but that of their own passage, and the incessant striding pouring of the rain. It was pitch dark. Here and there a white gate or a white stone in the wall guided them for a short space across the night. But for the most part it was at foot pace, and almost groping that they picked their way through the resonant blackness of their solemn and isolated destination. In the sunken woods that traversed the neighborhood of the burying ground, the last glimmer failed them, and it became necessary to rekindle a match and re-illuminate one of the lanterns of the gig. Thus, under the dripping trees and environed by huge and moving shadows, they reached the scene of their unhallowed labors. They were both experienced in such affairs, and powerful with a spade. They had They had scarce been 20 minutes at their task before they were awarded by a dull rattle on the coffin lid. At the same moment, McFarlane, having hurt his hand upon the stone, flung it carelessly above his head. The grave in which they now stood almost to the shoulders was close to the edge of the plateau of the graveyard, and the gig lamp had been propped to better illuminate their labors against a tree, and on the immediate verge of the steep bank descending to the stream. Chance had taken sure aim with the stone. Then came a clang of broken glass. Night fell upon them. Sounds alternately dull and ringing announced the bonding of the lantern down the bank, and its occasional collision with the trees. A stone or two, which had dislodged it in its descent, rattled behind it into the profundities of the glen, and then silence, like night, resumed its sway. And they might bend their hearing to its utmost pitch, but naught was to be heard except the rain, now marching to the wind, now steadily falling over miles of open country. They were so nearly at the end of their abhorred task when they judged it wisest to complete it in the darkness. The coffin was exhumed and broken open, the body inserted in the dripping sack and carried between them to the gig. One mounted to keep it in its place, the other, taking the horse by the mouth, groped along the wall and bush until they reached the wider road of the Fisher's Tryst. There was a faint, diffused radiancy, which they hailed like daylight. By that they pushed the horse to a good pace, and began to rattle along merrily in the direction of the town. They had both been wetted to the skin during their operations, and now, as the gig jumped among the deep ruts, the thing that stood propped between them fell now upon one and now upon the other. At every repetition of the horrid contact, each instinctively repelled it with a greater haste. And the process, natural though it was, began to tell upon the nerves of the companions. McFarlane made some ill-favored jest about the farmer's wife, but it came howlily from his lips, and was allowed to drop it in silence. Still, their unnatural burden bumped from side to side, and now the head would be laid, as if in confidence, upon their shoulders, and now the drenching sackcloth would flap icily about their faces. A creeping chill began to possess the foul Fets. He peered at the bundle, and it seemed somehow larger than at first. All over the countryside, and from every degree of distance, the farm dogs had accompanied their passage with tragic ululations. And it grew and grew upon his mind that some unnatural miracle had been accomplished, that some nameless change had befallen the dead body, and that it was in fear of their unholy burden that the dogs were howling. "For God's sake," said he, making a great effort to arrive at speech, "for God's sake, let us have a light." Seemingly, McFarlane was affected in the same direction, for though he had made no reply, he stopped the horse, passed the reins to his companion, got down, and proceeded to kindle the remaining lamp. They had by that time got no farther than the crossroad down to... I don't know how to say this. Alchenglini? The rain still had poured as though the deluge were returning, and it was no easy matter to make light of such a word of wet and darkness. When at last the flickering blue flame had been transferred to the wick and began to expand and clarify and shed a wide circle of misty brightness around the gig, it became possible for the two young men to see each other and the thing they had among with them. The rain had molded the rough sacking to the outlines of the body underneath it. The head was distinct from the trunk, and the shoulders plainly modeled. Something at once spectral and human riveted their eyes upon the ghastly comrade of their drive. For some time McFarlane stood motionless, holding up a lamp. A nameless dread was swathed, like a wet sheet, about the body and tightened the white skin upon the face of Fets. A fear that was meaningless, a horror of which could not be, kept mounting to his brain. Another beat of the watch and he had spoken, but his comrade forestalled him. "That is not a woman," said McFarlane in a hushed voice. "It was a woman when we put her in it," whispered Fets. "Hold that lamp," said the other. "I must see her face." And as Fets took the lamp, his companion untied the fastenings of the sack and drew it down to the cover of the head. The light fell very clear upon the dark, well-molded features and smooth-shaven cheeks of Two familiar in countenance, often beheld in dreams of both these young men. A wild yell rang up into the night. Each leaped from his own side of the roadway. The lamp fell, broke, and was extinguished, and the horse, terrified by this unusual commotion, started off and went towards Edinburgh at a gallop, bearing along the way with it sole occupant of the gig, the body of the dead and long dissected Grey. And that was that. That was the whole story. I'm not entirely sure. Not entirely sure where that was going. However, the story is inspired by true events. This was apparently during the time of the Burke and Hare murders, which is a string of murders of basically a bunch of people disappearing and then being refound shortly dead. So like someone would be missing for a couple days and they would reappear having been murdered. So that was something. That was there. Trying to remember. I've done a few Edgar Allen Poe stories, so I don't want to repeat ones that I've already done. Oh, excuse me. One moment. Okay, I have done the Telltale Heart before. I'll do... This is only an hour. I'll do another one. I could attempt the Raven again. Sure, why not? As I update this. Let me see if I can find a better formatting of this. Here we go, that's better. Short water break. This will probably be the last story. Or, well, this is a poem, but this will be the last reading for tonight. The Raven. Let's try it again. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow For my bookcase of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore. For the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here, for evermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. So now, to still that beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor, entreating entrance at my chamber door. Some late visitor, entreating entrance at my chamber door. This is it, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, so faintly you came tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened the wide door, darkness there and nothing more." Deep into that darkness peering long, I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token. And the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore?" This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul with me burning, soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see, then, what the threat is, and this mystery implore. Let my heart be still a moment and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore, not the least obedience, obeisance made he. Not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mine of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a palace just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven thou," I said, "art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore, for he cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing a bird above his chamber door. Bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such a name as Nevermore. But the raven sitting lonely on the placid bust spoke only that one word, and if his soul in that one word he did outpour, nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than murmured, "Other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before." Then the bird said, "Nevermore." Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, "Doubtless," said I, "what it utters is only a stock and store, caught from some unhappy master who unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of nevermore." But the raven still beguiling my fancy into smiling. Straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of a bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself into linking fancy unto fancy, thinking that this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore, meant by croaking "Nevermore." I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushioned velvet lining that the lamp lighted gloated over, with this velvet violet lining with the lamp light glowing over, she shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the truffled floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee. By these angels he hath sent thee respite, respite, and nepenthe from these memories of my Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff, this kind of nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether temper sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there a balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still of bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden if, within the distant Aidenn, I shall clasp it a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of a parting bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit that bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight over him streaming throws and shadows on the floor. My soul from out that window that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. I forgot that was a lot shorter than I had anticipated. So that won't be the last one. Excuse me. We'll do... I think it's this one. Yes. We'll do one more. For real this time. And this will be... Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allen Poe. That's another short story. When a terrible plague ravages his country, Prince Prospero summons all of his friends together, writhing the walls of a fortress-like abbey, where they hope to live in safety until the plague has passed. God damn it. Stop that. There we go. The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allen Poe. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar, and its seal the redness of the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores, with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and the dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castled abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron, for the courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave the means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of a frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons. There were improvisation. There was ballet dancers. There were musicians. There was a beauty. There was wine. And all these and the security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of this seclusion, and while pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at the masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7 in the imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back neatly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bazaar. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon the closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass whose color varied in accordance with the pearlage hue of the decorations of the chamber to which it opened. At the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue and vividly blue, were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lightened with orange. The fifth was white, the sixth with violet. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over from the ceiling, and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon the carpet of the same material and hue. But in the chamber only, the color of the window failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum, amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro, or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle with the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood opposite to each window a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that protected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illuminated the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings throughout the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit to the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical. But of so peculiar a note that emphasis that, at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance, to hearken the sound. And thus the waltzers perforce ceased to their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over the brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows to each other that the next chiming of the clock should produce them in no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds that the time flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then there was the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There were some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of his great fete, and it was his own guiding taste which he had given character to the masqueraders. To be sure that they are grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been since seen in Hermione. There were arboresque figures and unsuited limbs of appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon there strikes the ebony clock, which stands in the hall of the velvet. And then, for a moment, all is still, and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells and the dreams live, and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which streams the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the 7, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appeals. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears to indulge in the more remote gaiety of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And the revel went whirringly on until at length there commenced a sounding of the midnight upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there were an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of the thought crept, with more of time, into meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled. And thus too it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there rose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. Hi, Otto. Welcome in. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-heroed Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom in life and death are equally jests, there are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage made so clearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all around might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers around. But the murmur had gone too far to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with a scarlet horror. Here, listen to cozy vibes? Hell yeah. When the eyes of the Prince Prospero fell upon his spectral image, which, with a slow and solemn movement, as if fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed, in the first moment with a strong shudder either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely with the courtiers who stood near him, "who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was an eastern or blue chamber, in which stood Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang through the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement to his group in the direction of the intruder, but the moment was also near at hand, and now, with a deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the murmur had inspired from the whole party, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that unimpededly he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the wall, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first. Thank you for the follow, STKTJ. Hope you enjoy the story. I lost my place. But with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity. Why is that weird? Impetuosity. To within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death Prince Prospero. And then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves onto the black apartment, and seizing the murmur, all whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony cloak, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like Masque, which they handled with so violent a rudeness, unattended by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the light of the ebony clock went out with that last of the and the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gray, and the flames of the tripods expired, and the darkness and decay, that the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. And that is the Masque of the Red Death. Should I do one more? This feels very short otherwise. I've done 3 now, 3 stories? Well, 2 stories and a poem. I think I'll do one more. Feeling very Edgar Allen Poe-ish. I'll save The Fall of the House of Usher for another time. We'll do a classic. I've already done Telltale Heart. Do Cask of Amontillado. I just realized I say his name wrong. Amontillado. Amontillado. Armadillo? Sure. Last story. I keep saying it's the last one, but they're shorter than I expected. Alright. The Cask of Amontillado. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best as I could, but when he ventured upon insult I vowed revenge. You, who so well known the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitely settled, the very definitiveness of which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed with retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I forgiven Fortunato, caused to doubt my goodwill. I continued, as was my in to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my to smile now was at the thought of his immolation. He had a weak point, this Fortunato. Although in other regards he was a man to be respected and even feared, he prided himself on his connoisseurship in wine. Few Italians have true virtuoso spirit. For the most part, their enthusiasm is adapted to suit the time and opportunity, but practice imposture upon the British and Austrian millionaires. In painting and gemmery, Fortunato, like his countrymen, was a quack, and in the matter of old wines, he was sincere. In this respect, I did not differ from him materially. I was skillful in the Italian vintages myself, and brought largely whenever I could. It was about dusk one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had a tie He had on a tight-fitting, artist-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap of bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today. I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "How?" he said. "Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible, and in the middle of the carnival." "I have my doubts," I replied, "and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You are not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain." "Amontillado? I have my doubts. Amontillado, and I must satisfy them. Amontillado. As you are engaged, I am on my way to Lutresi. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me, Lutresi cannot tell Amontillado from sherry. And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own. Come, let's go." "Whither? To your vaults?" "My friend, no, I will not impose upon your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement. Lutresi, I have no engagement. Come." "My friend, no, it is not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceive you are afflicted. The vaults are insufferably damp. They are encrusted with nitre. Let us go, nevertheless. The cold is merely nothing. Amontillado, you have been imposed upon, and for such as Lutresi, he cannot distinguish sherry from Amontillado." Thus speaking, Fortunato possessed himself of my arm, and putting on a mask of black silk and drawing a roquelaire closely about my person, I suffered him to hurry me to my palazzo. There were no attendants at home. They had absconded to make merry in honor of time. I had told them that I should not return until the morning, and had given him explicit orders to not stir from the house. These orders were sufficient, I well knew, to ensure their immediate disappearance, one and all, as soon as my back was turned. I took from their sconces 2 flambeaux, and giving one to Fortunato, followed with him several suites of room to the archway that led to the vaults. I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. We came at length to the foot of the descent, and stood together upon the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montresors. The gait of my friend was unsteady, and the bells upon his cap jingled as he strode. I'm so sorry. That was a big misspeak. "The pipe," he said. "It is further on," said I, "but observe the white web work which gleams from these cavern walls." He turned towards me and looked into my eyes with 2 filmy orbs that distilled the rheum of the intoxication. "Nitre?" he asked at length. "Nitre," I replied. "How long have you had that cough?" My poor friend found it impossible to reply for many minutes. "It is nothing," he said at last. "Come," I said with decision. "We will go back. Your health is precious. You are rich, respected, admired, beloved. You are happy, as I once was. You are a man to be missed. For me, it is no matter. We will go back. You will be ill, and I cannot be responsible. Besides, the Lutresi—" "Enough," he said. "The cough's a mere nothing. It will not kill me. I shall not die of a cough." "True, true," I replied, "and indeed I had no intentions of alarming you unnecessarily, but you should use all proper caution. A draught of this medoc will defend us from the damps. Here I knocked off the neck of a bottle which I drew from a long row of its fellows that lay upon the mould. Drink," I said, presenting the wine. He raised it to his lips with a leer. He paused and nodded to me familiarly, while his bells jingled. "I drink," he said, "to the buried that repose around us. And I to your long life." He again took my arm and we proceeded. "These vaults," he said, "are extensive." "The Montresors," I replied, "were a great and numerous family." "I forget your arms." "A huge human foot d'or. A field azure, the foot crushes a serpent rampant whose fangs are embedded in the heel." "And the motto?" "Nemo me impune lacist." "Good," he said. The wine sparkled in his eyes and the bells jingled. My own fancy grew warm with the medic. It had passed through long walls of piled skeletons with casks and punchrons intermingling into the inmost recesses of the catacombs. I paused again, and this time I made bold to seize Fortunato by the arm above the elbow. "The niter," I said. "See? It increases. It hangs like moss upon the vaults. We are below the river's bed. The drops of moisture trickle along the bones. Come, we will go back ere it is too late. Your cough." "It is nothing," he said. "Let us go on. But first, another draught of the medic." I broke and reached him a flagon of the Grave. He emptied it at a breath. His eyes flashed with a fierce light. He laughed and threw the bottle upwards with a gesticulation that I did not understand. I looked at him in surprise. He repeated the movement, a grotesque one. "You do not comprehend?" he said. "Not I," I replied. "Then you are not of the Brotherhood." "How?" "You are not of the Masons." "Yes, yes," I said. "Yes, yes." "You? Impossible." "A Mason." "A Mason," I replied. "A sign," he said. "A sign?" "It is this," I answered, producing from beneath the folds of my roquelaire a trowel. "You jest," he exclaimed, recoiling a few paces. "But let us proceed to the Amontillado." "Be it so," I said, replacing the tool beneath the cloak and again offering him my arm. He leaned upon it heavily. We continued our route in search of the Amontillado. We passed through the range of low arches, descended, passed on, and descended again, arrived at a deep crypt in which the foulness of the air caused our flambeau rather to glow than flame. "Hi, Buzz. Welcome in." At the most remote end of the crypt there appeared another less spacious. Its walls had been lined with human remains, piled to the vault overhead in the fashion of the great catacombs of Paris. 3 sides of this interior crypt were still ornamented in this manner. From the 4th side, the bones had been thrown down, laid promiscuously upon the earth, forming at one point a mound of some size. Within the wall thus exposed by the displacing of bones, we perceived a still interior crypt or recess, in depth about 4 feet, in width 3, and in height 6 or 7. It seemed to have been constructed for no special use within itself, but formed merely by the interval between 2 of the colossal supports of the roof of the catacombs, and was backed by one of their circumscribing walls of solid granite. It was in vain that Fortunato, uplifting his dull torch, endeavored to pry into the depths of the recess. This termination the feeble light did not enable us to see. "Proceed," I said. "Herein is the Amontillado. As for Lutresi, he is an ignoramus," interrupted my friend, as he stepped unsteadily forward, while I followed immediately at his heels. In niche, and finding in an instant he had reached the extremity of the niche, and finding his progress arrested by the rock, stood stupidly bewildered. A moment more and I had fettered him to the granite. In its surface were 2 iron staples, distant from each other about 2 feet horizontally. From one of these depended a short chain, and from the other a padlock. Throwing the links about his waist, it was about the work of a few seconds to secure it. He was too much astounded to resist. Withdrawing the key, I stepped back into the recess. "Pass your hand," I said, "over the wall. I cannot help feeling the niter. Indeed, it is very damp. Once more, let me implore you to return. No, I must positively leave you, but I must render you all the little attentions in my power." "The Amontillado," ejaculated my friend, not yet recovered from his astonishment. "True," I replied, "the Amontillado." As I said these words, I busied myself along the pile of bones which I have before spoken. Throwing them aside, I soon uncovered a quantity of building stone and mortar. With these materials, and with the aid of my trowel, I began vigorously to wall up the entrance of the niche. I had scarcely laid the first tier of the masonry when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had a great measure worn off. The earliest indication I had of this was the low moaning cry from the depth of the recess. It was not the cry of a drunken man. There was then a long and obstinate silence. I laid the 2nd tier, and the 3rd, and the 4th, and then I heard the furious vibrations of the chain. The noise lasted for several minutes, which during which that I might have hearkened to it with the more satisfaction. I ceased my labors and sat down upon the bones. When at last the clanking subsided, I resumed the trowel, and finished without interruption in the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th tier. The wall was now nearly upon level with my breast. I again paused, and holding the flambeau over the masonwork, threw a few feeble rays upon the figure within. A succession of loud and shrill screams bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form seemed to thrust me violently back. For a brief moment I hesitated. I trembled. Unsheathing my rapier, I began to grope about it about the recess, but the thought of an instant reassured me. I placed my hand upon the solid fabric of the catacombs and felt satisfied. I reapproached the wall. I replied to the yells of him who clamored. I re-echoed, I aided, I surpassed them in volume and in strength. I did this, and the clamor grew still. It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. But there remained a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. I placed it particularly in the destined position. But now there came from out of the niche a low laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. It was succeeded by a sad voice, which I had difficulty recognizing as that of the noble Fortunato. The voice said, "A very good joke indeed, an excellent jest. We will have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo. Over wine." "The Amontillado," I said. "Yes, the Amontillado. But is it not getting late? Will they not be awaiting us at the palazzo, the Lady Fortunato and the rest? Let us be gone." "Yes," I said. "Let us be gone." "For the love of God, Montresor." "Yes," I said, "for the love of God." But to these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called aloud, "Fortunato?" No answer. I called again, "Fortunato?" Still no answer. I thrust a torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came a 4th, in reply only a jingling of bells. My heart grew sick. It was the dampness of the catacombs that made it so. I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up. Against the new masonry, I re-erected the old ramparts of the bones. For the half of a century, no mortal has disrupted them. In pace requisite. That was the Cask of Amontillado, which I've apparently been saying wrong for a very long time. How have I been saying it? I said Amontillado. I added an extra letter in there. Oops, my dyslexic likes to fuck around with some words sometimes. Yeah, instead of Amontillado, I would say Amontillado. I like yours better, thanks. I try to keep to the original as best as I can. But apparently my voice was not ready to read today. I feel it like scratching a little bit, so I apologize if that came through. But as short as this was, I think I will call it here. I read 3 stories in a poem, but I've read 4 whole things. Most of them Edgar Allen Poe. But I need to have dinner. We started dinner kind of late. So, thank you all for joining me. Hope you had a good time. Hope it was cozy. Even though these are horror stories. Hope it was cozy for everybody. But, have a good rest of your night. I will send you over to... Was your horror best horror? True. send you over to Nissa. And shockingly, not as per usual, she's playing Fallout New Vegas. Usually she's playing Elder Scrolls Online, but looks like she had a change of pace. So we're gonna say hello to Nissa, the lovely Firefly Princess. Go ahead and copy one of those. The first one is for subscribers, second one is for followers. My brain short-circuited, sorry. Go ahead, copy one of those. Go say hi to her. If you want to listen to the rest of the stories or the stories that I had read before, I will be putting this on YouTube as a VOD. I believe. If you'd like to go follow me there and see this show up in roughly an hour, you're welcome to. You're also welcome to follow me on my other socials, blah blah blah. Self-promotion, who cares? Stay safe, stay hydrated. I'll see you tomorrow for possibly Balatro. I want to save Paper Mario for just a little bit longer. I want to give you guys a little bit of a break. But I'll see you guys tomorrow for something. Stay safe, stay hydrated. Bye-bye.